The moment I knew my marriage was over didn't come with screaming or tears. It came with a smell. A sharp, unfamiliar sweetness, powdery, floral, young, rose from my husband's briefcase like a confession that hadn't learned how to whisper yet. For exactly 40 seconds, I stood there in my kitchen, 61 years old, holding a leather briefcase that cost more than my first car, thinking, well, this is how it starts. Let me be clear, I wasn't snooping. Richard had rushed out the door late that morning, already halfway into a phone call, already apologizing to someone who wasn't me. He forgot his briefcase by the island, right next to my coffee mug and my reading glasses. The holy trinity of a woman who no longer moves fast for anyone. "Can you bring it by the office?" he'd asked, distracted, kissing the air near my cheek. I said yes. I always said yes. That was one of my many charming flaws. I lifted the briefcase to check for his iPad. That was all. Just the iPad. I'm not the type who digs through pockets looking for sins. At my age, if I go looking for disappointment, I usually find it without help. But when I opened the inner compartment, something small rolled against my palm. A perfume bottle. Not mine. It was travel-sized, elegant, the kind of thing young women buy because they still believe their lives fit into carry-ons. The glass was warm, recently handled. I didn't even need to spray it. The scent had already escaped, bold and careless. I inhaled once. That was enough. I know perfume. I know which ones I wore in my 30s, trying to be taken seriously, which ones I wore in my 40s, trying to be desired, which ones I abandoned in my 50s when I realized smelling like myself was a radical enough choice. This one wasn't nostalgia, it wasn't comfort, it was intention. I closed the briefcase slowly, like you close a coffin when you don't want to wake the dead. For a moment I laughed. A short, dry sound, the kind that surprises you with how calm it is. I looked around my kitchen, the marble island, the orchids, the quiet wealth I had built with a man who once loved me carefully, and thought, of course it's perfume. Men never cheat with silence. They cheat with accessories. I made the coffee anyway. That's the part no one tells you. Betrayal doesn't knock everything off the shelves. Life keeps moving. The kettle still boils. The morning light still slants across the floor like it always has. You just stand there differently, holding information you didn't ask for but can't unlearn. I didn't cry. I didn't call a friend. I didn't confront Richard that night. I took the briefcase to his office like a good wife. I handed it to him with a smile that felt rehearsed but wasn't. He thanked me, distracted again, already elsewhere. And as I walked out into the street, the city loud and indifferent around me, I realized something that should have scared me more than it did. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was curious. Because perfume, unlike lies, is meant to be noticed. And whoever she was, she had just stepped into my life without knowing I was the kind of woman who paid attention to details. Especially the ones people thought were too small to matter. It's strange what betrayal sharpens. Not rage, not drama, attention. Once you know where to look, everything becomes louder. The pauses, the edits in his sentences, the way Richard started treating our conversations like draft emails, polite, efficient, stripped of unnecessary warmth. That first night I watched him across the dinner table the way one watches a stranger on a train. Same face, same hands, but his presence felt outsourced. "How was your day?" I asked, twirling pasta I didn't intend to eat. "Busy," he said. Meetings, plural, always plural now. A convenient fog. I nodded like a woman who believed him. I had worn that role long enough for it to fit comfortably. The wife who didn't interrupt, the wife who didn't ask for timelines, the wife who understood that important men had important lives, and wives were meant to orbit quietly, like moons. I used to think that was maturity. Now I recognized it as training. Later that night, as Richard showered, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and studied my reflection the way women do when they're trying to remember when exactly they disappeared. The face looking back at me wasn't sad. It was edited, softened at the edges, as if life had slowly turned down my volume without asking. I thought of the perfume again. Not with jealousy, with anthropology. You don't cheat at 60 with impulse, you cheat with curation, with someone who makes you feel upgraded, younger, more visible. Someone who laughs half a second too late at your jokes, because admiration requires timing. I remembered the dinners I'd hosted for Richard's colleagues, the introductions that began with his name, then landed on mine as an afterthought. This is my wife Helen, like a footnote, like a credential already verified. At some point, I had become invisible by being agreeable. The realization didn't break me, it clarified me. The next morning, I went to my yoga class like nothing had changed. Same instructor, same mat, same women who smiled politely and forgot each other's names every week. In the locker room, I caught a whiff of that same perfume on someone else, sharp, eager, and felt something almost like amusement. It wasn't her, it was the idea of her. Back home, I opened my laptop and did something I hadn't done in years. I followed my curiosity without guilt, not snooping, researching. There's a difference, and women my age are excellent at it. I checked Richard's calendar, public events only, art openings, networking mixers, fundraisers I declined because I was tired. I wasn't tired, I was unnecessary. One event stood out, a gallery opening downtown. PR handled by a firm I recognized, young talent, aggressive branding, the kind of place where perfume mattered. I closed the laptop and laughed quietly, so this was the shape of it. I wasn't being replaced at home. I was being replaced in public. That night, Richard kissed my cheek again, the air near it, really, and asked if I'd be late the next evening. No, I said. Why? Just checking, he replied, already relieved. That's when I understood the most humiliating part. He wasn't afraid of losing me, he was afraid of being seen, and suddenly the perfume bottle felt less like an insult and more like an invitation. Because if I had learned anything in 61 years, it was this. Invisible women see everything. And when they finally step back into the light, no one knows how to look at them without flinching. Once you accept that you've been edited out of your own life, curiosity becomes a form of self-defense. I didn't stalk. I observed. There's a difference, and women my age know how to walk it in low heels. Richard's calendar was the first tell, not the private entries. Those were still locked behind passwords and the illusion of loyalty, but the public ones. Art openings, fundraisers, networking events that had once been ours and had quietly become his. I noticed how often the same names repeated, how one PR firm appeared again and again like a watermark. That was the shape of her. She wasn't hiding in hotel rooms, she was standing under track lighting, holding a champagne flute, wearing ambition like perfume. The gallery opening was on a Thursday night, downtown, industrial chic, exposed brick and moral flexibility. I knew the type. I'd helped build careers in rooms like that before men started thanking me less and assuming I'd always be there. I told Richard I was meeting a friend for dinner. He didn't ask who. That alone told me everything. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I wanted to see her before she saw me. Power, I've learned, belongs to the person who recognizes first. She was easy to spot, not because she was extraordinary, but because she was intentional. Early 30s, perfectly imperfect hair. A black dress that whispered effortless while clearly having tried very hard. She laughed with her whole face, the way women do when they still believe laughter opens doors. And there it was. The perfume. The same sharp floral note cut through the warm air, confident, slightly aggressive. It clung to her like a signature she expected to be remembered by. I watched her work the room, the timing of her smiles, the way she angled her body toward power without appearing obvious. She wasn't careless, she was practiced. Then Richard arrived. He didn't touch her. Not here, not publicly. But his body adjusted the moment he saw her, like a man stepping into a version of himself he preferred. Younger posture, softer eyes, a half-second pause before he smiled. That pause hurt more than any kiss could have. They spoke closely. Too closely for colleagues. Too distantly for lovers pretending not to be seen. A private language performed in public. I waited. At some point, she leaned in to say something, and Richard laughed. Really laughed. The kind he used to save for me when we still believed in each other. That was when I stopped feeling sad. I felt something cleaner, sharper, not jealousy, recognition. She wasn't stealing my husband, she was auditioning for my life. And Richard? He was letting her. I didn't approach them. Not yet. I had no interest in theatrics. I stayed long enough to understand the ecosystem, then left quietly, my absence unnoticed, an irony so perfect it almost felt deliberate. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent and alive. I stood on the sidewalk and took a breath, cataloging what I'd learned. She worked in PR, cultural spaces, image management, a career built on perception, on polish, on being seen as appropriate. Interesting. Because perfume, I realized, only works when it's invisible. Too much, and people start to notice for the wrong reasons. I smiled to myself, the idea forming not as anger, but as design. I still had the bottle, and suddenly I knew exactly what it was for. I didn't do it right away. Revenge, like good tailoring, requires patience. You don't cut while your hands are shaking. You wait until the fabric tells you where it wants to fall. The perfume bottle sat on my dresser for 3 days. Small, elegant, offensively innocent. Each morning I noticed it the way you notice a spider in the corner of the ceiling. Aware, alert, but not panicked. I went about my routines. Coffee, Pilates, emails I didn't answer because I no longer felt obligated to be efficient for other people's comfort. Richard, meanwhile, was lighter, humming, distracted in that buoyant way men get when they believe they're winning something without consequences. On the 4th night, he showered early. That was my window. I locked the bedroom door, not because I was afraid of being interrupted, but because I wanted the moment to belong entirely to me. I placed the bottle on the marble counter and unscrewed the cap. I smelled it properly this time. It was expensive, bright, aggressive in its optimism, the kind of scent that announced itself before the woman wearing it had finished entering the room. I imagined her wrists, her neck, the deliberate press of skin against glass. Then I poured it out, not dramatically, no shaking hands, just a clean, quiet stream disappearing into the sink like something that had overstayed its welcome. When the bottle was empty, I rinsed it twice, dried it carefully. I wasn't sloppy. Sloppiness leaves fingerprints. The vinegar came next, clear, ordinary, unremarkable, the opposite of perfume in every way. I filled the bottle slowly, watching the liquid rise, replacing fantasy with inevitability. I smiled. This wasn't cruelty. This was chemistry. I screwed the cap back on, wiped the glass until it gleamed, and returned the bottle to Richard's briefcase exactly where I'd found it. Inner pocket, right side, tucked as if it belonged there. Because it did. At dinner that night, Richard talked about an upcoming gallery event. Same one I'd attended. Same one she'd worked. You should come, he said casually, eyes on his plate. It might be fun. I looked up, meeting his gaze. No, I replied. I don't think that's my scene anymore. He nodded too quickly. Relief passed across his face like a small, private victory. Later, as he dressed, I watched him from the doorway. He slipped the bottle into his pocket without checking it, without thinking. Men never check the details they assume are under control. That was the arrogance. The next evening, he kissed me goodbye, briefcase in hand, already elsewhere. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window as the city darkened, imagining the sequence. The moment she'd reach for it, the instinctive spray, the pause. Vinegar doesn't announce itself immediately, it waits. I slept better than I had in weeks, not because I felt powerful, but because I felt precise. The next morning, Richard came home unusually quiet. He moved carefully, like a man trying not to spill something already staining him. Everything okay? I asked. He hesitated. Fine. Just weird night. I nodded, unbothered. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need answers. Because the thing about replacing perfume with vinegar is this. You don't need to watch the reaction. You just need to know it's coming. Power doesn't announce itself loudly. It clears its throat and waits for you to notice. I met Margaret Klein on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of Tuesday that smells like polished wood and restrained ambition. The gallery was closed to the public. Private viewing, donor-level quiet. White walls, expensive silence, and people who spoke softly because they were used to being listened to. Margaret stood near a large abstract piece, hands folded loosely, posture relaxed in the way only truly powerful women allow themselves. Early 60s, silver hair cut with intention, creative director, senior partner, gatekeeper. The woman whose approval could build a career, or quietly erase it. Emily's career. Margaret recognized me first. Of course she did. Women like her always know who belongs in a room before anyone opens their mouth. Helen, she said warmly. It's been a while. Too long, I replied, smiling. The kind of smile you earn after decades of not needing anything immediately. We spoke about art at first. About funding, about how exhausting it was to keep spaces like this clean, creatively, ethically. Her eyes were sharp, amused, mine were calm. We were two women fluent in subtext. Then she tilted her head slightly. How is Richard? There it was. Oh, I said lightly. Busy, thriving. He's been attending quite a few openings lately. Margaret hummed. non-committal. A pause stretched between us, elegant and deliberate. I could have filled it. I didn't. Instead, I said, almost absent-mindedly, I came across a perfume recently, very assertive. It reminded me how much scent can change the temperature of a room. Her gaze sharpened, not suspicious, but alert. Yes, she said slowly, it can also linger where it doesn't belong. I met her eyes, held them. I used to wear something similar, I continued, my tone conversational. Years ago. Eventually, I realized it didn't suit spaces that required discretion. Another pause, this one colder. Margaret exhaled through her nose, a small, knowing smile forming. Helen, she said, are you telling me something, or are you trusting me to understand? I would never burden you with my private life, I replied gently. I just value clarity, especially in shared environments. That was all it took. Power recognizes power. It doesn't need evidence presented in manila folders. It needs patterns, implications, reputational risk. Margaret nodded once. Decision made. I've invested a great deal in Emily, she said, almost to herself. She's talented, ambitious. Of course, I agreed. Talent is easy to find. She looked at me then, really looked. Character, she finished, is more fragile. We stood together for another minute, silent, aligned. No promises exchanged, none needed. As I turned to leave, I passed Emily across the room. She was laughing, radiant, confident, wearing that same perfume. The scent followed her like a declaration. She smiled at me politely, didn't recognize me. Not yet. I smiled back. Outside, the city felt sharper, clearer. I understood something then that settled deep in my bones. I didn't need allies who felt sorry for me. I needed allies who protected their own power. And I had just found one. Public humiliation doesn't arrive with a drum roll. It slips in quietly, riding on something people think they recognize. The event was a Thursday night, black tie optional, discretion mandatory. A museum fundraiser on the Upper East Side. Marble floors, soft lighting, voices tuned to a frequency that suggested generosity without sincerity. The kind of room where reputations were curated as carefully as the art. I arrived alone. Not late. Not early. Right on time. The hour when attention was evenly distributed, and no one yet suspected anything interesting might happen. Margaret was already there. She stood near the center of the room, surrounded by trustees and donors, her presence anchoring the space without demanding it. When she saw me, she inclined her head. No smile, just acknowledgement. That was enough. Emily entered 15 minutes later. She looked flawless. Of course she did. Ivory silk dress, minimal jewelry, hair styled to appear effortless. Confidence wrapped around her like a second skin. She moved through the room as if she belonged to it, not because she owned it, but because she believed it would eventually belong to her. Richard hovered nearby, attentive but careful. He knew better than to touch her here. This wasn't a place for hunger, it was a place for appearances. I watched as Emily reached into her clutch. The bottle emerged small and familiar, catching the light like an accessory meant to be noticed. She didn't look around, didn't hesitate. She lifted it to her wrist and sprayed. Once, then again. At first, nothing happened. People leaned in. Conversations continued. The room held its breath without knowing why. Then the smell bloomed, sharp, acidic, unmistakable. Not loud, but wrong. Emily's smile faltered, just a fraction. She lifted her wrist again, confused, sniffed lightly. Her brows knit together. Someone nearby shifted uncomfortably. Another guest leaned back, polite but alert. Margaret turned her head. Slowly. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened with immediate clarity. She didn't react with surprise. She reacted with assessment. Emily laughed too loudly, saying something about bad batch or odd lighting, waving it off. She tried to recover, but the scent followed her, clinging now, impossible to ignore. Perfume is supposed to invite. This repelled. Richard stiffened. His eyes darted, landing on me for half a second too long. I met his gaze, neutral, composed. The realization flickered there, late, ugly, undeniable. Margaret stepped closer to Emily, not confrontational, professional. Emily, she said calmly, may I have a word? Emily's face brightened with relief. She nodded eagerly, grateful for rescue. They moved toward a quieter corner, but silence followed them like a shadow. People watched without staring. The way experienced observers do when they sense a shift in gravity. I couldn't hear the words exchanged. I didn't need to. Margaret's posture was firm, her voice low. Emily's shoulders tightened. She nodded too much. Touched her wrist again. then dropped her hand as if burned. A minute later, Emily excused herself abruptly and left the room. Not dramatically, but definitively. The scent lingered even after she was gone, a ghost of miscalculation hanging in the air. Margaret returned to her circle, composed as ever. When our eyes met across the room, she gave me the smallest nod. Not approval, confirmation. I finished my drink and left shortly after. Outside, the night air was clean, cool, forgiving. For the first time, I felt no need to explain myself to anyone. Some lessons don't require witnesses. They just require the right audience. The real consequences never happen in the room where the mistake is made. They happen afterward, quietly, efficiently, without witnesses. By the next morning, the city had already moved on. New scandals, new invitations, new rumors sharpened and softened in equal measure. But in our apartment, time had slowed to a crawl. Richard came home late, not dramatically late, just late enough to signal avoidance. His briefcase hit the floor with a dull thud. The sound of something finally too heavy to carry carefully. He loosened his tie, then retied it, as if order might reappear if he handled fabric correctly. I didn't ask where he'd been. That unnerved him more than any accusation could have. He poured himself a drink he didn't finish. Sat. Stood. Sat again. The silence stretched, elastic and unforgiving. "They're postponing some projects," he said finally, staring at the wall. "Temporary, just optics." "Whose optics?" I asked gently. He flinched. "Everyone's." That was my answer. Emily didn't call him anymore. That much was obvious. No late-night vibrations, no furtive smiles at glowing screens. Her name, never saved, always disguised, had vanished from his routines like a bad habit broken by fear. Instead, there were emails. He didn't show them to me, but I saw the subject lines when he forgot to lock his laptop. Restructuring, reassessment, moving forward, polite words, surgical ones. By Friday, it was official. Emily was taking time away from public-facing roles, a sabbatical, they called it, for her own growth, her own reflection. Margaret's phrasing, no doubt, merciful, devastating, final. Richard read the announcement twice, then once more, like it might change. "She's young," he muttered. "She'll recover." "Of course," I said. "Most people do. Eventually." He looked at me then, not angry, not pleading, smaller, like a man who had misjudged the size of the room he was in. "You were there," he said quietly. Not a question. "Yes." "And you knew?" "Yes." His jaw tightened. "You planned this?" I considered him. "Really looked?" "No," I replied. "You did." That was the moment something in him collapsed, not loudly but completely. He sank into the chair, rubbing his face with both hands. "I didn't think it would go this far," he whispered. "Men never do." That night, he slept on the far edge of the bed, as if distance might absolve him. I lay awake, not from pain, but from an unfamiliar sensation settling in my chest. Relief. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't begged. I hadn't needed to explain myself to anyone with authority. The world had done the work for me, the way it always does when you stop interfering with the truth. A week later, Margaret sent me a note. Brief. Elegant. "Thank you for your discretion. Spaces remain clean when people respect them." I folded the card and placed it in a drawer. Emily would rebuild somewhere else. Richard would shrink into a version of himself that fit his choices. And I was still here. Still standing in my kitchen. Still breathing without effort. The thing about aftermaths is this. They don't feel explosive. They feel quiet. Like a house after a storm, when you realize the structure is still intact, but everything unnecessary has been stripped away. Leaving didn't feel like escape. It felt like administration. The decision arrived one morning while I was watering the orchids. Same routine, same window light, same quiet apartment that had once felt like a shared achievement, and now felt like a well-managed illusion. Richard watched me from the doorway, careful not to cross some invisible line he'd finally learned existed. "I don't think this is working," he said, testing the sentence as if it might collapse. I didn't look up. "No," I replied. "It isn't." He waited for more. Apologies, accusations, negotiation. There was none. By the time people reach my age, drama feels indulgent. Paperwork feels honest. I called the attorney that afternoon, not Margaret. This was no longer about power, but a woman recommended quietly by another woman who'd survived a very public marriage. The meeting was brief, efficient, prenup reviewed, accounts separated, options outlined without judgment. "You're in a strong position," the attorney said, not smiling. "Would you like to proceed discreetly?" "Yes," I said. I prefer quiet endings. Richard signed without a fight. That surprised him more than it surprised me. He'd expected anger, I think, some last attempt to feel important by provoking a reaction. Instead, he found himself dismissed with courtesy. He moved out on a Sunday, 2 suitcases, the briefcase, no perfume bottle inside this time. He hovered at the door like a guest who'd overstayed and finally noticed the host checking her watch. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "I know," I replied. "That's what hurts." He nodded, accepting that explanation the way people accept a diagnosis, too late to argue, too early to fully understand. When the door closed, the apartment didn't echo. It exhaled. I sat on the floor and laughed, not from joy, from relief so sudden it startled me, the kind that loosens muscles you didn't know you'd been clenching for years. In the weeks that followed, my life reorganized itself without resistance. The joint accounts became singular. Invitations arrived addressed only to me. I declined most of them, not out of bitterness, but because I was no longer interested in rooms where I had to calculate my presence. Margaret sent another note, shorter this time, wishing you well. That was all. It was enough. Emily disappeared from the circuit entirely. A new firm, a different city. Reinvention, they called it. Good for her. Reinvention is expensive. It costs you your illusions first. One afternoon, I packed away the last of Richard's things, a forgotten cufflink, a tie I'd bought him years ago when I still believed gestures could anchor people. I didn't keep anything. I wasn't sentimental about endings. That night, I slept diagonally across the bed, claimed the space fully. Recklessly. Leaving didn't make me lonely. It made me precise. Because when you exit without spectacle, without begging to be understood, you take something invaluable with you. Your dignity. Rebuilding doesn't begin with inspiration. It begins with space. The first thing I did after Richard left was nothing. I didn't redecorate. I didn't reinvent myself with a new haircut or sign up for pottery classes like a woman in a streaming drama. I simply allowed the apartment to exist without explanation. Mornings became quieter, not lonely, clean. I drank my coffee slowly, without glancing at another calendar. The silence stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like permission. At 61, permission is intoxicating. I returned to my old studio on the west side a week later. I hadn't been there in years, not because I didn't love it, but because loving things openly had slowly begun to feel inefficient in my marriage. The key turned stiffly in the lock, protesting my absence. Inside, dust motes floated in the sunlight like unfinished thoughts. I opened the windows. Let the city in. For the first few days, I didn't create anything. I organized, cleaned brushes, sorted papers, threw away half-finished ideas I'd been too polite to abandon before. It felt good to discard things without guilt. One afternoon, while unpacking old notebooks, I found a line I'd written years ago and forgotten. If you don't choose your life, someone else will curate it for you. I laughed out loud. Apparently, I had always known. People began reaching out, not dramatically, not urgently. Quiet invitations, lunches, museum walks. Women I'd lost touch with when my marriage had required too much maintenance. I said yes to some, no to most. The ones I chose felt different. No explanations required. No one asked how I was really doing, that invasive kindness people mistake for concern. They treated me like a woman whose life was continuing, not collapsing. That was the greatest kindness of all. I started writing again, not for publication, not for validation, just to hear my own voice without interruption. I wrote about scent, about rooms, about how power shifts when women stop performing gratitude. It surprised me how easily the words came. One evening, while I was closing up the studio, a man held the door open for me. Late 60s, gray at the temples, a calm, observant face. "You work here often?" he asked. "I used to," I replied. "I'm starting again." He smiled. Best time to do anything. I didn't give him my number. He didn't ask. The exchange existed without expectation, and that alone felt luxurious. Back home, I bought a new perfume. Not expensive, not trendy, something subtle, warm, unapologetically mine. I sprayed it once on my wrist and waited. It stayed close, didn't announce itself, didn't demand to be noticed. Perfect. I realized then that rebuilding wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about returning to someone I'd edited out slowly, carefully, for the sake of peace. Peace, it turns out, was never the goal. Clarity was. And now that I had it, everything else felt negotiable. The last thing I packed wasn't furniture or files. It was memory. I stood in my apartment on a Sunday morning, the windows open, the city drifting in the way it always had. Sirens far away, footsteps below, life continuing without commentary. The boxes were already stacked neatly by the door. The apartment was sold. Clean ending. Clean lines. I was leaving Brooklyn Heights, not because it hurt to stay, because it no longer held me. On the bathroom counter sat the new perfume, the one I'd chosen without asking anyone what they thought. No marketing story, no promise of seduction, just a scent that felt like skin after sunlight. I sprayed it once, that was enough. At 61, excess feels juvenile. As I locked the door for the last time, I didn't feel nostalgic. Nostalgia assumes loss. What I felt was accuracy, the quiet satisfaction of a decision made at the right moment. People had asked if I was angry, if I missed him. If it was hard starting over at this age, their voices lowered as if time itself were a diagnosis. I smiled politely and said what made them comfortable. The truth was simpler. I missed the woman I had been before I started negotiating my presence. Before I learned how to be easy, before I confused peace with disappearance. But she hadn't been destroyed. She'd been waiting. I moved into a smaller place overlooking the river, light-filled, minimal, nothing unnecessary demanding care. The first night I sat on the floor with a glass of wine and let the quiet settle. Not the quiet of avoidance, but the quiet of completion. A week later I ran into Richard by accident. Of course it was an accident. Life has a sense of humor that way. We passed each other outside a cafe. He looked thinner, older, less certain. The city didn't seem to part for him anymore. "Helen," he said, surprised. "Richard." That was all. No apologies, no explanations, no delayed monologue he'd rehearsed for closure. We nodded politely and continued in opposite directions. I didn't look back. Some men age poorly because they confuse being wanted with being necessary. Later that afternoon, I met Margaret for tea. Neutral territory. No power dynamics left to negotiate. "You seem well," she said, studying me over the rim of her cup. "I am," I replied. She smiled, satisfied. "Good. That's the best outcome." On my way home, I passed a boutique and paused. In the window, a familiar perfume bottle caught the light. The same brand, same design, different promise. I felt nothing. Scent, I realized, only has power when it's borrowed. That night, I wrote the last line in my notebook. Some women don't need revenge, they need reclamation. I closed the book, sprayed my wrist once more. The scent stayed close, warm, quiet, exactly where it belonged. Not announcing itself, not asking permission, just staying. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, almost forgettable moments. It arrived the first time I laughed alone in my kitchen and realized no one was listening for it, judging it, or needing it to mean anything. It arrived when I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen, stopped editing my thoughts before they fully formed. It arrived when my body relaxed. One morning, months later, I noticed I was standing differently. Shoulders back, breath deeper, movements unhurried, as if my body had finally received permission to take up space again. I hadn't lost weight. I hadn't gained confidence in the cinematic sense. I had simply stopped apologizing to the air. People sometimes ask what finally healed me. They expect a moment, a lesson, a grand realization. I tell them the truth. Nothing dramatic happened. I planted herbs on the windowsill and remembered to water them. I learned the pleasure of cooking only what I wanted to eat. I walked without destination. I slept without negotiating my comfort. I stopped explaining my choices to people who had no intention of understanding them. I forgave Richard without informing him. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a message, it's a release. And Emily? She faded into abstraction. Not a villain, not a victim. Just a woman who crossed paths with my life long enough to remind me of myself at an age when I'd confused being chosen with being valued. Sometimes late in the evening I still spray my perfume before bed. Not to be noticed, not to be remembered. Just because I like the way it lingers, soft, familiar, unbothered. That scent has become my favorite proof. Proof that life doesn't end when something breaks. Proof that silence can be generous. Proof that starting over isn't about youth, it's about honesty. I didn't get revenge. I got myself back. And that, it turns out, is the ending that lasts.